All right, we're ready for Galatians 1 and 2. Galatians will finish out this trimester, and then we, of course, change at the first of the year. For those who haven't been with us until the last year or so, just a little note on what this program is. This is a survey, designed to be a survey, 5-year survey through the Bible, meaning that we're trying to cover the entire Bible in 5 years, and that's generally what we've done every time we've been through. And so we didn't design this program, but we've borrowed it and tweaked it. But I mentioned that to say that when we take a book like 2 Corinthians and we don't have enough chapters to fill up the quarter or the trimester, then you fill it in with either the next book or one that'll fit there. Well, Galatians may not fit there where we put it. By that I mean, we really could take about 12 weeks on Galatians, but we're going to take 3 weeks on Galatians. So that means we're taking 2 chapters. So we know that. So you say this is a lot of material to cover in one lesson. We know that. And you're right. And so just get in line and complaining about that, because I'll be the first one to complain. So you get behind me and we'll complain about this being a little too much material. Got that? So we got some ground to cover. So let's give a little bit of introduction to Galatians. We'll get the bird's eye view of Galatians. And that's not bad. I think often about studying a letter like Galatians, that the Galatians, when they received the letter, probably didn't take 10 weeks to read it. They probably read it in one setting. Now think about that. Did they get the message? They may have to read it again, but they probably got it in one setting, the message thereof. And so we're going to get it in 3 settings. So we may have 3 times the advantage of the Galatians. So anyway, for what that may be worth, let's give a little introduction to this. Galatia. This letter differs from other letters in that it is not written to a single church like the church at Corinth or the church at Philippi or the church at Thessalonica. This is written to the churches, plural, of Galatia. A large group of Gauls, G-A-U-L-S, migrated from north of the Black Sea and settled in Asia Minor in the 3rd century BC. They derived their name Galatia from the Gauls, Galatae, from which we get our term Galatians, meaning nobles. This was made a Roman province about 64 BC. From about 25 BC to 72 BC, they expanded to the lower region. And after 72 AD, I said BC, but 72 AD, they faded in significance. I won't go into the question, are we talking about northern Galatia or southern Galatia? There is a question as to whether the term is used here in Galatians in the ethnic sense or the provincial sense. I'll leave that to you to determine. I think it's probably the latter, meaning that he's talking to those churches. All of this region here, this, if you recognize, this is the Mediterranean Sea here, and this is Palestine, and the region of Galatia would include the northern part and the southern part, that many think that we're probably talking about those churches that were established in the first missionary journey, like Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra, and Derbe. Those would have been included. Were others included? Maybe. Because I can't exclude it to just those. If there were other churches besides Antioch, Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe, and there's another 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 10, then they would be included as well. So I can't exclude that. So we could spend probably another 30 minutes on, are we talking about the northern region or the southern region? And when we get through, you will probably be as edified when we get through as you are right now about that. We're not going to accomplish a great deal. So he's writing a letter to the churches of Galatia. Now let's talk a little bit about the date of the letter. It would have to be after the events of Acts 15 if our understanding of chapter 2 is correct. And that is, it is parallel and is the same event of Galatians 2 and Acts 15 being the same. It probably was after 2 Corinthians. It bears some similarity to 2 Corinthians because of the nature of the book. Now, one of the advantages of shifting it in here and crowding it in at the end of 2 Corinthians is because they're very similar. We're going to see some similarity in the 2 books. Let's talk about the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book is to deal with some of the criticism of Paul and his doctrine. And so this, you say, well, that's the same thing 2 Corinthians was about. You're right. It is the same message of 2 Corinthians. Approach just a little bit different. This is an outline that I've put together of Galatians that I talk about simply as justification by faith apart from the law. And the heart of the book is chapters 3 and 4, but chapters 1 and 2 is Paul's defense of his apostleship. He defends his apostleship because he's under fire and under criticism. And that's what chapters 1 and 2 are about. That's what 2 Corinthians was about. And you remember that we talked, and so then we're going to talk about justification by faith apart from the law and then the practical section. So you have the personal section, you have the doctrinal section, and you have the practical section. See the significance of the three sections? So we're going to look at the personal section concerning himself, his apostleship. That's where we're going to focus here. Now, we don't have time to deal with each one of these in detail, but I just want to get a gist before you. This is taken from Galatians, not 2 Corinthians, but Galatians. These are some of the criticisms made of Paul. He received his apostleship through man, chapter 1. His teaching was received from others. He just borrowed his teaching from someone else. He doesn't have the approval of the other apostles. He's not recognized by the other apostles as being a true apostle, and his authority was inferior to the 12. So he's not a genuine apostle. So they are doing that. Why? Why would they discredit his apostleship? And if you missed this one, you didn't listen in 2 Corinthians, and we're going to start all over. Yeah, because this very principle, the authority of Paul is directly connected to his doctrine. And so what they're after is trying to knock this doctrine of salvation by faith in Christ apart from the law. And in order to discredit this, they need to discredit his authority. If he's teaching you can be saved apart from the law and he's an apostle, guess what? They're wrong. So they've got to discredit his authority. Does that make sense? Now, if you miss that, you need to go back to the 2 Corinthians class because we got to go back through that again. That was what 2 Corinthians was about. Make sense? All right. So let's talk about chapter 1 now. That's all the introduction we're going to give. There's more we could talk about, the nature of the letter. It seems to be somewhat of a hasty letter. It doesn't have quite the introduction that other letters have. He seems to fire it off rather hastily. You may agree or disagree with that, but that maybe is the case. All right, Galatians chapter 1. What's Galatians 1 about? What's the point of Galatians 1? I think Micah had a question on that, did we not? Question 1 would summarize that anyway. What's question 1? How would you summarize these two chapters? What's chapter 1? How would you summarize it? All right. The source of his apostleship. So he's pointing out, and Mitchell's right about that. He's talking about being an apostle, not of men, but of God. He's got to defend his apostleship first. Then he's going to defend his doctrine, chapters 3 and 4. So let's get his apostleship here. Verses 1 to 5, the claim made, that is, I am an apostle. There's the claim. Then the warning given about false teachers, and then the evidence provided. Now we're going to go a little quicker through chapter 1 because chapter 2 is the more difficult chapter. Would you agree? All right, let's do that. Let's talk about the claim made. In verse 1, he says, Paul, an apostle. He's got 3 words into the letter, and he's already said something that's going to upset him. Paul didn't upset him, but an apostle does. He's made the claim. So here's the claim. He's an apostle not after men or through men. I'm an apostle not after men, but through men. So the question is, how did he receive his apostleship? It's not from man. In other words, it didn't originate from a body of men. It's divine in origin. Nor is it through men. That's a distinct point. That is, it's not through human agency. No man stood between God and Paul. In other words, God didn't have someone else to make him an apostle. But he says it is, when he talks about his source and the agency, that he's made an apostle by Jesus Christ. Jesus is the source, and Jesus was the agent. Make sense? No one else made me an apostle. All right. Now then, starting at after the greetings, what does verse 4 and 5 say? Yeah. affirms the doctrine that he's going to be defending in chapters 3 and 4. Salvation comes through Christ, not the keeping of the law. But he points out just simply that God, that he might deliver us from the present evil age, according to the will of God our Father, to him be glory forever and forever. He delivered us from the world and from the things of the world and sin and all the claims of the world. All right, so here's the claim. I'm an apostle. He sends greetings and salvations through Christ. But the main thing we need to see is he's made the claim to be an apostle. Now let's move to verse 6. What's verse 6 through 9 say? Absolutely. He marvels at something. What does he marvel? In other words, I'm amazed. Bingo. Absolutely. In a relatively short time. So if our provincial use of the term Galatians is used, if that's how it's used here, then not long after he had been there and established these churches and well informed them of the truth of the gospel, false teachers influenced them and led some of them astray. So he said, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of God into a different gospel. King James says you're moved. American Standard says removing. I'm amazed that so quickly you're removing from the gospel. Now this is an interesting, you probably have this noted from previous studies. If not, this would be a good time to do it. If you're reading from the King James, it will say they called you to another gospel, which is not another. That sounds contradictory. Or your New King James says it's a different gospel, which is not another gospel. Those are two different words there in the original. In verse 6, when the word another, that's the King James rendering of that, it is a word that means of a different kind. I'm amazed that you have been carried away to another gospel that is of another kind of gospel, different from the revelation of God, which is not another, it's a different word this time, of the same kind. Make sense? It's not a contradiction at all. It is saying you were carried to a different gospel that differs from the revelation of God. It's not a different one like of the same kind of gospel. That is from another apostle who's preaching the same thing. That's not what you've been carried away with. Now let's get verses, go back to verse 7, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. What do you learn from that? Just anything practical from verse 7. All right. False teachers never have your best interest at heart. They pervert the gospel, they twist and wrest the scriptures, and they lead you astray. So here's the warning. You've been led away by false teachers. Now, what's his warning in 8 and 9 about false teachers? Something we ought to pay attention to. Absolutely. If you didn't hear what Diane said, if they teach anything other than what's revealed, they're a false teacher. Notice what he says, if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which has been preached unto you, then let him be cursed. When someone says, I received a revelation, you say, God talked to me and God gave me a revelation, or an angel talked to me, well, it's false. Even if an angel teaches you something contrary to what's been revealed, it's false. And that's his point he's making here. Now, we can say more about that in verses 8 and 9. I just want you to get this overview picture. He's made the claim, I'm an apostle. Here's the warning, you've been led away by false teachers, and these false teachers are to be accursed. Now, let's talk about the evidence that he provides. He makes another claim here, not just that he's an apostle, but let's look at 10 to 12. He makes the claim that he is an independent apostle. Now, what does that mean? That he was not made an apostle by the other apostles. He received his apostleship directly from God. He made that claim in verse 1 of chapter 1. So let's see what his claim is here. So starting at verse 10. For do I seek to persuade men or God? Do I seek to please men, or and if I still please men, I would not be the servant of Christ. What's he saying? Absolutely. Yeah, I'm not out pleasing men. I'm not trying to create a doctrine to please men. Let's go further. Verse 11. So he's claiming independent apostleship. Look at verse 11. But I make known to you, the brethren, that the gospel that was preached by me was not according to man. Verse 1. Remember that a moment ago. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. What's his point? Yeah. Yeah, where I got my message, I don't seek to please men. I didn't receive my gospel from man. What I did is I received my gospel from the revelation of Christ. Paul, give us some evidence of that. Now, as we read through this, or cursory reading through this, it may sound like he's kind of shifted gears and he's talking about kind of his life history. And he does that, but there's a point to that. Let's see if we can get the point. Part of the evidence is from his life before his conversion, verses 13 and 14. Before his conversion, without reading verses 13 and 14, scan that. What was it like before he was converted? What did he do? Persecuted the church. He advanced Judaism, verse 14, being more zealous than they all. In other words, his conduct is before he was converted shows evidence that he did not have an opportunity to learn this gospel from man. In other words, he didn't go sit at the feet of the apostles and learn it, and then he claims to be one of the apostles too. I didn't have the opportunity to do that. All right? Second evidence from his conversion itself. Let's look at 15, 16, and 17. But it pleased God who separated me from my mother's womb to call me through his grace to reveal his son to me that I might preach him among the Gentiles. His footnote. The Lord appeared to Saul not to blank him, but to make him fill in the blank. He didn't appear to him to save him, but to make him an apostle. That's what he just said. That he appeared to me that I might preach him among the Gentiles. The Lord didn't appear to him to save him, but that he might become a preacher to the Gentiles. So here's the point that he's making. Well, let's go ahead to verse 17. I didn't go to Jerusalem, that is, there were many days according to Acts 9 and the parallel account in Acts 22, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went into Arabia and returned again in Damascus. In other words, I didn't spend time with the apostles. So his point is, from my conversion, I didn't choose to be an apostle. God chose me. He's trying to give evidence I'm an independent apostle. All right, let's go further. Let's talk about his first visit to Jerusalem. Yes, sir. Absolutely. So now, verse 18. After how long? After 3 years, I went to Jerusalem, talking about Acts 9, Acts 22. I went to Jerusalem to see Peter and remained there 15 days. But I saw none other of the apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Not claiming that he was an apostle, he's just saying, I didn't see anyone else. Now, verse 20. Now concerning these things I write unto you indeed, before God I do not lie. Now let's come back to verse 21. What's his point here about his first visit at Jerusalem? His point is, I'd already been preaching the gospel 3 years before I ever met the first apostle. Does that make sense? I didn't go to the other apostles and sit at their feet and learn, and then I claim to be an apostle like they are. I'd been preaching this message for 3 years before I met my first apostle. Yes, ma'am. No, no. You couldn't learn it all in 15 days to be doing the kind of preaching that the Apostle Paul was doing. That's a good point. Now let's get verse 21 through 24. I know this isn't a bird's eye view. I've got that. But let's get his point. And after it, I went to the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was unknown by face to the churches of Judea, which were in Christ. And though they were hearing only that he had formerly persecuted us, now preaches of faith, which he once destroyed. In other words, I was far, when I went on and preached the gospel, I was far removed from the other apostles. What he's trying to show is that before I became a Christian, let's go back through these steps. Before I became a Christian, I wasn't sitting at the feet of the apostles. I didn't have opportunity to learn from them. At my conversion, God chose me. I didn't choose him. Thirdly, when I went to Jerusalem, I was only there 15 days, but that was 3 years later. And I'd already preached this message before I ever met my first apostle. And then I went into Syria and Cilicia, and I wasn't around the apostles. So how on earth do you think I learned this from the rest of the apostles? By sitting at their feet, and they made me one. I'm an independent apostle. Does that make sense? That's his claim. Now, on a cursory reading of that, we think, okay, he's just talking about his history. He's making a point about his apostleship. Questions on chapter 1? Yes, ma'am. No. That's a good point. No, that would not be the guy that, hey, he would make just a prime apostle, I think, since he loves us so much. No, he wouldn't be at all. Good point. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Good point. Good point. That's exactly right. He is focused on Christ. All right. Chapter 1 makes sense. We're going to move to chapter 2. I just tried to get this bird's eye view of chapter 1. An apostle, not of men, but of God. Here's my claim. I'm an apostle. And I'm warning you, these false teachers are trying to carry you astray. Don't listen to them, even if an angel's telling you. Don't listen to them or an angel or anybody else. And here's the evidence I'm an independent apostle. Look at my history. Before, during, and after my conversion, there's no way that I could have been made an apostle by man. All right. Let's get how chapters 1 and 2 lace together. Paul's message is from God. He's equal to the other apostles. Chapter 1 focused on the source of his apostleship and message. Came from God, not from man. Chapter 2 deals with his endorsement from the other apostles. So there's two things, 1 to 10 and then 11 to 21. Two thoughts in chapter 2. In chapter 2, verses 1 to 10, the other apostles approved of Paul and his message, and then he rebuked Peter. And that's not just oh, by the way, let me tell you about me. I had a kind of a fuss with Peter, but he makes a point about his apostleship in that. And so we'll see what that is when we get there. All right. There's two things. If you're copying this, I meant to go back and change my wording here. He was approved by the apostles at the Jerusalem discussion. I like the word discussion better than conference. Everybody in all the commentaries, they talk about the Jerusalem conference. This really wasn't a conference as such, but call it that if you like. I did here. But I like the word discussion better. It was a Jerusalem discussion, but it was a meeting of the apostles and the elders concerning circumcision. So that's verses 1 to 10. He was approved by the apostles there, and then he rebuked Peter. So let's talk about this Jerusalem discussion before we get into the verses themselves. Is this talking about the events of Acts 15? Or is it talking about another event? I want to just give evidence that he's talking about Acts 15. Now, I don't mean if someone wants to say, well, I think it's another event, and then we're not going to get very far. But these are some verses where these are parallel, is what I'm trying to show here. Both took place at Jerusalem. Both involved a meeting of the apostles. Both involved opposition. Both involved the issue of Gentiles being circumcised. Peter participates in both. James participates in both. Paul participates in both. And Paul and Barnabas continue after both. And so could it be, is it a possibility? Is there some possibility somewhere that this is a different event than Acts 15? Sure it is. But I think it is Acts 15. I think it's the same thing. Now, the arguments that are generally made against it being the same are based upon assumption that Paul in Galatians 2 is enumerating all of his trips to Jerusalem. And there was the trip in Acts 9, there was a trip in Acts 11, and the trip in Acts 15. But his point is about endorsement, and he did not need to mention the second trip. But the assumption is that he mentioned all of his trips, and this is the second trip, so therefore it's not the same as Acts 15. Now, I know that's a hurried look, and you may have got lost in that, but I really think Acts 15 and Galatians 2 are parallel. You think they're not? Well, then they're different. and we're going to come out at the same point at the end. But that is a question that at least I wanted to wrestle with and preparing for Galatians 2. Let's talk about what happens here. His point here is, I was approved by the apostles at this Jerusalem discussion or Jerusalem conference. So let's work our way through this. He talks about the Jerusalem conference in verses 1 to 5, or Jerusalem discussion. And so let's start verse 1 and 2. After 14 years, I think that's after his conversion, not after the last thing that's mentioned, but after 14 years after his conversion, I went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas and also took Titus with me. Titus is going to be a test case. Why? He's Greek and he's uncircumcised. So are they going to demand him be circumcised? Now, there was an occasion where Paul had Timothy circumcised because he's trying to... All right, these Jews, yes, you're exactly right. When you're in Rome, you live like the Romans. In other words, he's trying to be of greater influence. But now the question is it going to be bound? Is it going to be put down as law? And when Titus is a test case, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So he went up by revelation, meaning because God told him to. And I communicated with them that the gospel which I preached to the Gentiles, but privately, there was a private meeting as well as public meeting to those who were of reputation, lest by any means I might run or run in vain. In other words, if circumcision was binding, what Paul is preaching and teaching is in vain. He's telling people you don't have to be circumcised. It'd be like me going out and teaching people you have to repent and have faith, but I don't mention baptism. If I'm wrong about that, which I would be, then my preaching is vain. It's useless. He said, if I'm not binding circumcision. So he said, Paul and Barnabas and Titus went up to Jerusalem, and the message that I preached, he said, I went and talked to them privately and publicly. And his point is, my message was not questioned among the apostles. But here's a case point, verses 3 to 5. What did he say in verses 3 to 5 about Titus? Yeah, he wasn't forced to be circumcised. That not even Titus, who was with me being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Now, if this is true, that circumcision is binding, when I took him to the apostles and to Jerusalem, they would have demanded that he's with me in the gospel, and they would have demanded he be circumcised. They didn't demand that. They didn't demand that. But somebody did. Who was it? Verse 4. False brethren, who secretly come in by stealth to spy out. In other words, they plot and work against us. That's what they were doing. They come in by stealth. Not everybody who is working against the gospel is out in the open, by the way. Here's a practical thing to learn. Are out in the open waving their hand saying, I'm a false teacher. Everybody pay attention. Some people work undercover. Be aware of that in local church. Sometimes people are working undercover and under darkness, and they're working by stealth. And some of these were. Now, verse 5, to whom we did not yield submission, not even for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with us. In other words, we didn't bow to the pressure of those false teachers. The apostles did not require. So you want evidence that what I'm teaching is true? I took Titus up there to Jerusalem with me, and they didn't say a thing about him being circumcised. And when I told them what I was preaching, I was not questioned at all about what I preached. Make sense? They continued on exactly with what they were preaching and what they were teaching. So that's what took place at the Jerusalem conference. Now then, his point about going to the Jerusalem conference is twofold. One is I went there, verses 1 to 5, my doctrine wasn't questioned. Yeah, but Paul, they didn't really give you any approval. Yeah, they did too. Look at verses 6 to 10. What does verse 6 say? But those who seem to be something, in other words, esteemed brethren, somewhat, the King James says. That's the apostles, I take. Whatever they were makes no difference to me. God shows no personal favoritism. For those who seem to be something added nothing to me. I think he's answering the argument that the original apostles had an advantage over Paul. The point is their association and long-term apostleship gave no greater advantage to his apostleship. That when I got there and I went to Jerusalem and I talked to the apostles, they added nothing to me. What does that mean? Say again. Yes, good point. Didn't make him any more of an apostle. They didn't do like they did with Apollos. Remember, Apollos had to be corrected. You've got it all wrong, and we need to correct you. They added nothing to me. In other words, he went and told the apostles, this is what I'm preaching. That's truth. They gave their endorsement to that. That didn't make it true. It was already true. And it wasn't a voting. Let's see if how we're going to agree on that. But he said, they added nothing to me. But on the contrary, verses 7 and 8, what did they see? They saw that the gospel had been committed to me. Look at verse 7. That the gospel for the uncircumcised, that is Gentiles, had been committed to me like the gospel of the circumcision to Peter. Peter had been sent to the Jews. I'd been sent to the Gentiles. That's what they concluded. Now verse 9. They did something else to Paul and Barnabas. They gave him the hand of fellowship. That when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace of God had been given to me, they gave Paul and Barnabas me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles. I mean, how greater endorsement of your teaching can there be than the apostles to extend you the right hand of fellowship and send you forth? You go back to the Gentiles preaching what you've been preaching. You see his whole point. Are we getting the point? His whole point is, I went to Jerusalem, and this big discussion about circumcision being binding, I got endorsement from the apostles. They didn't tell me I was wrong about anything. I took a test case there, and they didn't ask him to be circumcised. What more proof do you need that I'm preaching the truth on this? All right, now verse 10. They did ask one thing, though. What was that? That you remember the poor. So as I went to travel and to see to those who are in need and take funds to those who are in need. So again, this is a bird's eye view, but you see what happened at the Jerusalem conference or discussion? I went up there. They didn't tell me I was wrong about anything. They gave endorsement to what I was teaching. They gave me the right hand of fellowship. They saw that I was an apostle, and they extended to me and said, go further at preaching and teaching the gospel. So here's evidence of my claim that I am an apostle and that I'm preaching the truth. Exactly. There was agreement. Now, let's talk about the rebuke of Peter. Sometimes in reading, his whole point here is I'm not an inferior apostle. I went to the other apostles. They didn't think I was inferior to them. Here's another proof he's not an inferior apostle. This is not just a historical thing about Peter. We could spend 3 weeks just on the rebuke of Peter and some practical things, but let's get what his point is. Why does he mention the rebuke of Peter? He was an original apostle. What difference does that make in this story? Absolutely. Shows he's not inferior. Absolutely. He shows he's not inferior to Peter because he has the authority to rebuke him. And Peter was rebuked with the very gospel that's being called into question. So I went to one of the original apostles and told him he was not behaving like this gospel that I'm called into question about Gentiles being gospel subjects without being circumcised. I rebuked him with that message, and that shows two things. My message is true, and it shows Peter endorsed it, and it shows that I'm equal to Peter. That's his point. So let's see what he says. Starting at verse, I won't go through all that. Peter knew better, by the way. That's why it's called Peter's hypocrisy. Let's talk about his hypocrisy, verses 11 to 13. What does verses 11 to 13 say about his hypocrisy? Why do we call it hypocrisy?
He wasn't living according to the law, but he's acting like he expected the Gentiles to live according to the Old Testament law.
Very good. Who was the first man to go preach to the Gentiles and concluded Gentiles are now gospel subjects? Peter. Who had stood up and made one of the 3 major speeches at Jerusalem? Peter. And here then on an occasion, just a short time after Acts 15, he was with some Gentiles, and when some brethren came from James, he withdrew himself. Now, what does it mean brethren came from James? I don't know. It may mean they came from Jerusalem where James was. That may not mean that James encouraged this. It may mean James was just as inconsistent as Peter, and these brethren were coming from James and put pressure on Peter. And they were acting as a hypocrite as well. Maybe, I don't know. Some may have claimed to be from James, though they were not. I think that's the least of the possibilities there. But they came from James, and he said that Peter withdrew himself and would not associate with the Gentiles. Peter knew better than that. And so he said, I withstood him to his face because he was to be blamed. He was to be condemned, the American Standard. By the way, this is quite a public place to mention this, isn't it? And was this a private rebuke or a public rebuke? Seems like it's a public. Notice the text says at verse 14, I said to Peter before them all. His sin was public, and so his rebuke was public. So he said, I rebuked him to his face because he was to be condemned, verse 11. He wouldn't eat with the Gentiles. But part of the problem was Peter's influence. How influential was Peter on this occasion? Even Barnabas. That's interesting. Even Barnabas. Didn't say Barnabas was, but even Barnabas was carried away with his power. What does that suggest to you?
Because Barnabas had been preaching to the Gentiles. That was his whole thing with Paul. And he's like, well, even he was thinking maybe I shouldn't be with these people.
Yeah. These are the guys that have been preaching and defending this doctrine, and now they've kind of drawn back from it. That's not unusual for Peter, by the way. I don't have time to go into that, but we have some examples of where Peter would make bold statements and then back away from those bold statements, and that's not unusual for Peter. So he talks about his hypocrisy. Now, what does his rebuke say? Verses 14 to 21. Yeah, what hypocrisy. What hypocrisy. Notice what he says. Verses 14 to 16, we're justified by faith and not by the law. He makes that point. You know that, Peter. And so he said, you're not walking upright according to the truth of the gospel. But I believe it's Arndt Gingrich that translates verse 14 when it says, why do you compel the Gentiles? They translate, how dare you? I like that wording. You have been out preaching Gentiles can be saved just like Jews. How dare you treat Gentiles like they're unfit? How dare you, Peter? I mean, this is a pretty stern rebuke, isn't it? Pretty stout rebuke. And now drop down to verse 17 now. That why go back to the law? This is interesting. If while we seek to be justified by Christ, we are found sinners, if going back to the law, is Christ therefore a minister of sin? In other words, if eating with Gentiles is sinful, then Christ who told you you could do that is the master of sin. That's absolutely absurd. In other words, you say, well, I'm not getting the point. All right, if being baptized is sinful, say if somebody would argue it's sinful, Christ commanded me to be baptized, you're telling me Christ told me to commit sin. He's the master of sin. That's absurd. And so Christ told you could eat with Gentiles and said they're now gospel subjects. And so now verses 19 and 20, he goes back and makes this point. We're dead to the law. This is part of his rebuke. I'm convinced 14 to 21 is exactly what he said to Peter. I don't mean word for word, but this is the message I delivered to him. And so he talks about we're dead to the law and we're not living under the law anymore. Now verse 21, let's get verse 21. He said we're frustrating or setting aside the grace of God. If what you're doing, Peter, of indicating Gentiles are not gospel subjects, that's where you're acting, then the grace of God is in vain. And you're frustrating and setting aside the grace of God is what you're doing. So now, let's go back. What's the point of this? This is not just a story of a preacher fuss between Paul and Peter. What's his, because he rebuked Peter, therefore what? Absolutely, yes. It shows that Paul is equal to Peter in authority and that the gospel stood the test of public confrontation. This message I've been preaching, We got into a public confrontation with Peter over that, and it stood the test of time. And so now he's ready, chapters 3 and 4, to go into this discussion. Is that doctrine true? He's defended his apostleship, chapters 1 and 2. Next time, 3 and 4.